And we will continue now with the conference. And for our next panel, we will travel from Polowat and Saipan to Tahiti and the Society Islands. Our next presenters, we will have also met as organizers and moderators of this conference yesterday and today. But now I can introduce them to you as the panelists. So please welcome with me on stage, Anja Schwarz, Professor of Cultural Studies. And Lars Eckstein, Professor of Anglophone Literatures and Cultures, both from the University of Potsdam. Thank you.
Yorana, thanks everyone again for coming out. It's a true honor and a pleasure. And the first thing that we have to say, Anja and myself, is of course that we are not navigators. We're not even sailors. We work in literary and cultural studies. What we know is about archives. So we dig into texts and images and try and make sense of these. The other thing that is very important to stress is, of course, that we cannot speak for the Society Islands. We are from Berlin. This is why it was important for us to also host this conference here in Berlin and see how all these knowledges that we have heard from relate to the city, which houses many things Oceanian in the very spaces which we meet in here today. So it's special for us to be here. It's also that we've spoken about our research a lot all across the planet, including the Pacific, but I think only ever once here in Berlin. So it's great to be able to share that research with you. We also want to acknowledge the people we have worked with in Oceania over the past 12 years or so. In the Society Islands, I want to give a shout to my friend Libor Prokop, Mereho Anastas, Tamatua Bembridge, Paul Niva, Hinano Murphy. I hope that Moyata and Titawa, captains of Fafaite, are perhaps in the Zoom with us. We have friends in Aotearoa who've worked with us, Matahi Brightwell, Master Navigator, Peter Mehana, historian, working rather in our fields, and many, many more people whose names I can't tell, but thanks from the heart for having worked with us in all sorts of collaborations over the past. Our word of warning, we don't get to decide how much time we get, usually at other conferences, but since we've organized this, we've given us quite a bit of space. Apologies for that. We have a record number of slides. There are 99 chairs in this room. We can't have one more, I've learned, because that would require new fire precautions. And we have a PowerPoint slide for every chair. With that, I hand over to myself, because I'll start 5 minutes and Anja will take over and I do the later bit of the talk. Yes, there is no va'a from the Society Islands to the best of our knowledge in this collections. I also haven't seen a model in the depot on Wednesday. Nevertheless, we wanted to anchor our presentation today in the very space in which we are being hosted, and the most prestigious thing, Tahitian, that we have found in the permanent exhibition of the Oceania collection in the Forum is this Hewa Tupapa'u, a chief mourner's costume from Tahiti. It's very rare. If I counted correctly, there's only 10 of these out in the world. 2 in Germany, a slightly a complete one in Göttingen. This one here is incomplete. It actually needs a lot of tapa cloth and a chicken feather black cloak and a staff with it. There is 3 in the UK, I think, 1 in Spain and 2 in Hawaii, but that's it. So it's very rare, very special. This is the label. It is received in the Humboldt exhibition, which is a bit problematic in a number of ways. There's some factual mistakes Cook's second voyage was not 1777, that's the third voyage. To the best of our knowledge, that gown was not worn by priests, but it was worn by high-ranking ari'i. And I want to stress both men and women were wearing these cloaks. Most importantly, perhaps, and this is because this gown came to Berlin late, I think only in the 1930s from a private collector, the information about who retrieved it from Polynesia it's not wrong because they say it's doubtful, but it's definitely not Louis-Antoine Bougainville who got it out, but almost definitely Johann Reinhold and Georg Forster, the two naturalists on Cook's second voyage, German naturalists. Why do we know this? This is a brief history of the first visits by European ships to Berlin, and we went through all the records and histories. Wallace has not seen anything like this, and his crew. Bougainville, indeed, in the few days that he spent in the east of Tahiti, witnessed a morning ceremony, but there's absolutely no accounts that he got anything out. Cook on the first voyage in 1769, which will be what we will talk about mainly for the rest of today, witnesses a morning ceremony. His famous naturalist, Joseph Banks, is even invited to take part in one as one of the figures, Aninive, as they're called in the event, and they try very, very hard to trade in whatever they have for costume, but the Tahitians refuse to give any of that out because it's too sacred. Cook returns on his second voyage. That voyage first targets Tahiti. On first arrival, they don't get anything out either, but then they take a grand tour through the South Pacific. Cook's main job is to find the Great Southern Continent that doesn't exist. So they go to Tonga first, then to Aotearoa, then to the Arctic, come up via Rapa Nui to the Marquesas, and then come back to Tahiti in 1774. Now, importantly, when they come back, it seems that all 10 known chief mourner costumes leave the island. Georg Forster notes in his journal for an entry dating to 1774, much more surprising than this was the offering for sale those curiosities and singular mourning dresses, which are mentioned in Captain Cook's first voyage, and which they would not part with on any account at that time. These dresses being made of the rarest productions of their islands and of the surrounding sea. That's important because a lot of the feather and shell had to be retrieved like from quite far away in the networks at the time. And being wrought with the greatest care and ingenuity must of course bear a very considerable value among them. A number of complete mourning dresses, no less than 10, and those are all the 10 that we know of, were purchased by different persons on board and brought to England. Some of them then sold in England for astronomical amounts, like more than a year's salary of a sailor. And to our knowledge, no more mourning dresses left Tahiti ever again. So the great mystery is, why did they leave? And that story has to do with these little birds that you see here, the ura or the kura birds, which were extremely sacred in Tahiti at the time, and more importantly, either completely or almost extinct in the region. One had to retrieve those feathers from remote islands, either in the Southern Cooks or in a western outlier of the Society Islands, both called Manaura for those feathers. And those were insignia of the highest ranking ari'i, and extremely secret and sacred. What you see here is a to'o, in which the highest deity of Reatians at the time, figurines of the god Oro were housed, and those would have been covered for ritual occasions with red feathers. This is how sacred those feathers were. Now, what happened was that Cook took a young man on board, on behalf of the foresters from Bora Bora, a young Ari'i from Bora Bora, by name of either Hiti Hiti in the sources or Mahine. And when they arrived in Tonga, they found that Tongans had plenty of red feathers. Tons of ordinary pieces of artifacts were covered in red feathers, and Hiti Hiti instructed the forces to buy them all, trade in whatever they have for those red feathers. This the foresters did. Whilst they had nothing to do in the Arctic, Hiti Hiti bundled them in bundles of 8 to 10 feathers with a Senet rope. And when they came back to central Polynesia, starting in the Marquesas, and then especially in Tahiti, Tahitians would not accept any other currency than the red feathers for whatever they traded. They wouldn't give a pig anymore unless it was for red feathers. So what basically happened is that Europeans flooded the Tahiti sacred economy of the red feather, causing a massive inflation, basically. And it's grounded on that inflation that all those Chief Mourner costumes left the island some of the most sacred things that they had. Another thing is that what Tahitians were interested in was no longer any other European goods either, but whatever they could acquire from Tonga, from Aotearoa, from the Marquesas. They wanted their cousin stuff that the Europeans had traded in, rather than nails anymore or anything else. Another thing that I want to stress before Anja will continue is that Europeans were unable to find anything really about the significance of the things that they traded in for those red feathers, including the Chief Mourner costume. The foresters write, whenever we asked them what the significance of the various properties of that costume are, they basically stopped talking and wouldn't share any of those informations. That economy of information and knowledge sharing will be in many ways at the very heart of our presentation today. And we will argue that it's really been during the first voyage only, when Cook was fortunate enough to crew an amazing man to join him on the continuing voyage named Tupaia, that significant information about Oceania came to Europe. With this, I hand over to you.
We get a first idea of that sharing when we see this drawing of Chief Mourner costume that was done by Tupaia in 1769 during that first voyage. So there was something going on around Chief Mourner costumes and other knowledge that Society Islanders held that was shared with Europeans in that moment. And that's, as Lars said, that's what we'll talk about. My part now, I need to warn you, we need to get through those 100 slides, 99. We've only seen 4 or so. You might be wondering, we speed up, but just to also warn you, my part now is going to be a bit longer, and Lars's part then is also going to be a bit longer. Before we can tell you that story properly, I feel I must introduce Tupaia to the best of our knowledge. We need to say, first of all, there's no representation of him that I could share. So Lars and I decided to turn to this, I think it's 2018, 2019 publication from Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's a graphic novel, tells the story of Tupaia and Cook, and gives us a sense of what we're attempting to do here too, right? We're centering that story, centering Tupaia, wanting to tell his story on that voyage that is usually remembered as Cook's. So to the best of our knowledge and drawing on a lot of colleagues, who was Tupaia? He was a Raiatean arioi, a taua, a bearer of knowledge, came from a family of master navigators and was born roughly around 1725. He was trained at Raiatea's Tainui Marae as a younger man, and then later at Tapu Tapu Atea Marae, the most important center for sacred knowledge and navigational learning in Eastern Polynesia, or Eastern Oceania. The Marae would have preserved the oral legends and sailing instructions from exploration voyages of the past 800 years, which extended as far as to Hawaii in the north, Aotearoa in the south, Rapa Nui in the east, or as we have been saying lately, right? Maybe all the way to the Americas. Around 1760, Raiatea was invaded by Poroborans and Tupaia to flee Tahiti, where he soon became a man of social standing. He was presumably here when the presumably first Europeans, that is Captain Wallis and the crew of the Dolphin, set foot in Tahiti in 1767, Tupaia acted as chief diplomat. He was there, he was negotiating these exchanges. And when he met Cook and the Endeavour's crew 2 years later, that's when he decided to travel with them. The story that is usually told is that Tupaia was invited by Banks to come on board, but that sort of gets it wrong, we feel. He was more than a guest on board the Endeavour. That Cook respected and trusted him, for instance, is very evident from the fact that after leaving Tahiti, he lets Tupaia pilot the ship through the Leeward Society Islands. He lets him tell him exactly where to go and then how to navigate through the reefs and how to go on to, Raiatea and so on. So he trusts him with the Endeavour all the way through the Society Islands and on southwards across open waters to Ruvutu and the Australs group. Tupaia for the longest time has been a very marginal figure in a very, people didn't pay much attention to him, but well until, I think up until the 1980s, 1990s. But then he's been increasingly recognized by European scholars also as an active participant on that voyage, on that Endeavour voyage, and in the key moments of that voyage. Just to give you an example that many people in this room will probably know, when they get to Aotearoa, New Zealand, well, who speaks the language? When you have conflict, who can actually negotiate? Who can actually work that out? Who can make that an encounter that somehow works for both sides? It was Tupaia. He's most known for his map of Oceania that Lars and I have worked on and that we will talk about later on today, a map that Tupaia drew in collaboration with members of Cook's crew. But we want to begin with the drawing that you just saw and others, because we feel these drawings also deserve our attention. Tupaia has been identified as the artist of these drawings and a couple of others that are held in the British Library only for the past 20 years or so. Before that, and it seems almost impossible now, but that sort of tells you how far everybody has come. Before that, they were thought to have been drawn by a naturalist and learned gentleman, Joseph Banks, who had traveled with Cook on the Endeavour. And people sort of, trying to make sense of these drawings by European gentlemen, sort of say, well, maybe these are on the spot drawings. He's just very quickly sketching what he sees, and that's why they look so different. And there's a reason why they thought that. It's because there's an almost uncanny similarity or resonance between these drawings and what Banks writes about in his journal. Also what Cook writes about, but even more so what Banks writes about, what this scientist writes about. One entry among many in which this connection is immediately apparent concerns exactly the Chief Moana costume. Banks participated, as Lars said, in this ceremony on the 10th of June, 1769, and Banks's account of the events concludes with a reference to this drawing, in which he says, the figure annexed, so we need to imagine this figure next to the text, will explain it far better than words can. So people at the time thought, when this was sort of looked at, thought, well, great similarity between text, the drawing is there too, so surely all of this is Banks's stuff. This only, for European researchers, that made sense. This only changed when these researchers, historians and so on, people interested in Cookie stuff, began to pay attention to a letter written by Joseph Banks, in which Banks clearly stated that another image, and I don't have a big one of that, this one, You saw it in Mimi's film yesterday. That of Joseph Banks himself exchanging tapa cloth for a crayfish with the Māori chief had been drawn to Tupaia, by Tupaia. So Banks himself writes in a letter, there's a funny drawing of me by Tupaia. You know, it's quite comical because apparently both sides weren't sure when to let go of their part of the bargain, you know, their part of the deal. And there's the drawing. And he says, it was done by Tupaia, it works well, it illustrates that situation well. And then because people began to understand this drawing was done by Tupaia, out of his son, all of these drawings came to be seen differently. This is the work that sort of happened in the past 20 years. Now, while there's now appreciation for these drawings, aren't they amazing? Isn't it striking that here is a Tahitian with, you know, in Tahiti, people didn't have a drawing tradition, a European drawing tradition, that he can learn this so quickly. While there's that now, Lars and I feel that there's more to these drawings than just that. They're not just illustrations of moments on the voyage. They're not just funny in that sense of, you know, poking fun at Banks, for instance. There's more to them. We think it is pretty amazing that Tupaia, like many things that he learned to draw so quickly in a way that Europeans could make sense of his drawings when maybe his own style was very different. But that doesn't answer the question of why he does it in the first place. And it doesn't answer the question why Europeans, why Banks and others would have given him the paper and the colors to do so when paper and colors on that voyage at that time were precious, right? They were reserved to for the scientists to do their work, right? So why? Through our research, we're able to show that these drawings need to be understood differently. They need to be understood as records of conversations that they had. And I think all of us in this room this morning, right? How can Mario convey things to us? He sits down with a bowl and, you know, you do a drawing and you go, look, do you get it? And we even share language. Well, these people didn't share so much language at the time. There was limited Tahitian, there was limited English, and they turned to drawing as a means of communication. That's the argument. These are parts of conversations that took part July, August 1769. And basically, we are convinced that Tupaia used these images to explain society island life. He created them towards the end of the Endeavour stay in the Leeward Society Islands when Cook, Banks, and Parkinson were basically doing this. They're writing up. I think there are some anthropologists in the room. I think that's part of what you do, right? You write up at some stage. You sort of take all your field notes and you systematize whatever. I imagine it's roughly like that. They sit down and they write up, try to make sense of what they see, what they've learned, what they have seen. And when we read these accounts now, they are so perfectly organized and they so perfectly make sense, and they seem to know it all, right? They know everything about society island life from their own experience. That's what it sort of reads like to us these days, as if careful observation alone had given them insights into mourning ceremonies, right? Sailing, navigation, morais, warfare. When we see them together, with the drawings, you might get an idea of how central actually Tupaia's teachings were in that process, that Tupaia was their teacher in that very moment. Now, we want to discuss this drawing. This is the drawing we want to discuss in more detail now by Tupaia, and share with you some of what we think. Well, first of all, what we know the Europeans learned from Tupaia about vessels and navigation, and maybe also very carefully address some of the lessons that the Europeans did not learn, but that are there in this image. Because they didn't get everything, right? When you translate, when you try to read this, some things are missed too. You don't need to read all this, just to... Prominent in Tupaia's drawing are the two so-called war canoes in the image's bottom left, right? They're twin-hulled, We sort of see them side on, but they're twin-hulled with curved up sterns, and these hulls support a fighting platform, a race platform, for warriors to stand on. There's a lot to be said about them. We'll focus on a couple of things. What matters for our argument today is that James Cook, Joseph Banks, and their draftsman, Sidney Parkinson, include long descriptions of these war canoes in their journals, exactly when they're writing up. And these descriptions are much longer than this, right? I'm just giving you an excerpt here. So long descriptions of these war canoes and what they're good for. They know about vessel construction. They know about the crews, the different weapons. They know the battle routines. As I said, you don't need to read them, but just get a sense of how much they know. And then to be surprised, as we were when we read this closely, because Banks ends his account, where we think he knows it all, with this very sentence, this much from description, right? This much from description, for I never saw any of their battles. How then did he come to know about them? On what basis did Parkinson, the draftsman, eventually draw this, right? An elaborative wash, that is a watercolor, I think, black and white, of a war canoe, which in all likelihood, and from all we can tell, he had never seen. And that looks pretty weird to anyone who knows a bit about vessels, I think. Now, looking at Parkinson's and Banks' description in the context of Tupaia's drawing, let's go back to it again, it is clear that they correspond to a surprising degree. And we are certain that they're based, their descriptions and their drawing, on Tupaia's drawing. Tupaia's drawing portrays a battle in progress. It includes details of the plank-based construction, of the carved pillars that support the fighting platform, the rei mua and the rei muri, the carved figures at the prow and at the crafts-based stern. And Tupaia also shows us different fighting techniques, including light spears thrown at the opposing vessel, the clubs that are being used in person-to-person combat, and some, but not all of this information is repeated by the Europeans in their journals. Final proof that the Europeans' idea of naval warfare, Tahitian warfare, was shared by Tupaia, and that the sharing occurred around drawings, comes from James Cook. Now, Cook also doesn't see war canoes on the first voyage, but on the second one, the one with the Forsters, they get to see them. So they write and write and write about these war canoes. And Cook does too, describes them. And then he says, actually, again, sort of trying to explain how they work. He goes, actually, this is how they work. And then he says, we clearly understood from Tupaia on the first voyage, who made a drawing of one of these vessels, that's what they're good for, right? So that's, if we want proof in the European archive, that's the proof. Cook says it himself. He did not see it himself. He has it from Tupaia. It was evidently Tupaia's drawing then, and the conversations they would have had about it that let Europeans know about these vessels. Right? So a lesson to be learned there, and what we've thought for a long time Europeans did see in the Pacific, and what they actually learned from someone else. This one we've stared at for a day and a half now. So finally, again, Lars and I organizing this, we go on, use that image. This is Tupaia's depiction of a wa'amutu, a single hull voyaging canoe. And it is probably of greater interest to us here today. Its depiction is unique, not only in the context of the Endeavour's 1769 voyage, but also in the context of documented Society Islander vessel design at large. To the best of our knowledge, but happy to be corrected, and Mimi, thank you also already for pointing out things yesterday, and it's the only visualization we know of a single hull design fitted with rigs and masts for 2 sails. So it's not a drawer to the best we can tell, because it has a front, that's the front there. It has a back, but it has 2 masts. And it is special. We rely on any feedback we can get here today, whether or not what the sense we make of it here makes any sense, and how and whether it would have sailed. When I say it's the only account, it's not to say that they're the only sort of visualization. When I say that, that is not to say that there are not other accounts of a matching Tahitian construction. Actually, there are quite a few in French in particular in recent years, right? In Va'a, la pirogue polynésienne, Véronique Lippmann discusses a variant of the single hull Wa'amoto characterized by the presence of 2 stabilizing platforms and 2 sails. In Jean Neret's pirogue Oceanians, you know why I'm not doing French, right? I'm learning. He devotes an extensive discussion to an ancient outrigger vessel called Wa'amoto with 2 sails. And even earlier, Haddon and Hornell had discussed this particular design in their first volume of Canoes of Oceania from 36 to 38. And again, you know, they're probably the last of the true Wa'amoto and is the highest development of the Tahitian outrigger canoe. So when we look at these European sources, we go, oh yeah, exists. You'll sort of see we need Tupaia to actually prove it, because all of their accounts are based on a single source, the description and drawing of a double sail Wa'amoto, and a report published in 1843 by French Admiral François-Edmond Paris. This is the Wa'a sketch of the hull, and you'll see other versions of this in a moment. On his voyages, Paris documented traditional vessels from around the globe with detailed descriptions and architectural drawings. This particular hull of about 11 meters, he observed east of Matavai Bay on the Tahitian North Shore. Paris describes the hulls as having belonged to an ancient Voyaging Wa'a with 2 balancing boards. One of these boards, he says, was located in the center of the vessel where boards are linked, forming a long platform. Another platform attached to the front of the boat also has a cavity where the foot of the mast rests. Now we want to stress that Paris did not see the masts. He saw the hull. All he had in front of him on that beach, and we saw all he had in front of him on the beach were the hull and the outrigger. So that's what he had, but he was so sure of what he saw, and that's what we want to share with you, that he even drew this, and he even had a model made of it here after his return to France, of this particular design, which sits in the Musée National de la Marine to this day. It is this drawing and this model that is the basis of, current sort of discussions of this particular design. So there are European or Western sources that say, yes, this exists, but the only conclusive historical evidence we feel for the plausibility of Paris' drawing of a Wa'amoto under 2 sails would really be then Tupaia's drawing of 1769, right? Because he didn't see it. He didn't see it. He saw the hull. So what can we say then from this? We can say that in 1769, Tupaia's drawing of the Wa'amoto appears to have been at the center of a conversation about vessel design and Society Island voyaging capacities. As with the drawing of the war canoes, there are, for instance, sketches and washes by Parkinson of Wa'amoto, right? And we believe that Tupaia would have, for instance, looked at something like this and gone, that's roughly how they would draw. So I'll try and adapt some of that maybe for my own drawing. On the other hand, we can see here how much Parkinson would have needed help from an expert like Tupaia to correctly draw vessels. Here in this particular one, he had drawn them. He had drawn the mast isn't high enough and the rigging goes too high. It says in these annotations, and I've got it down here, not everybody can see. He says the ropes should come from this place. Mast and sail too small, too short. Right, so he must have sat down with someone, maybe he's also observing, but someone is also giving him feedback on his drawing and helping him correct it. Actually, it reminds me of a visit to the boats, to the vessels the other day again, right? How you walked in and you went, oh, the mast, that rigging, not so sure, mate. So I imagine that these are the kinds of conversations that were taking place. He's doing the best he can, as I'm sure curators here are doing, and yet it's better done in conversation with people who know their stuff. Parkinson was definitely learning. He was definitely trying to learn. And as we believe that someone who's drawing these things, he needs to learn because he wants, it's visual. He somehow needs all the information to get it right. And we can see him in this learning process. We can get a sense of it here. This is his, again, no need to read everything, but that's his vocabulary list. That's him on a particular day, sitting down with someone who's teaching him the vocab. And here's an Englishman with no training in how to write down other languages. So it's very hard to read. We're trying to give you a sense of that here. But among the Tahitian words recorded here are ihu for the flat board here. We have a word for the weaving that is attached to the mast, or tira, as Parkinson notes down. We have the huhui, the washboard, which is here. And names for many components of the vessel's rigging, such as, for example, a long term, which would maybe translate to something like whana taura tuara, a rope, and then Parkinson's translation, a rope coming from the top of the ie, or sail, and then fastened to the stern. So here's someone really trying to learn, and you can see, how this corresponds with many things in the drawing. So we can sort of see it, not saying that he necessarily learned from the drawing, but he's definitely someone who's learning. I'm stressing these links between Parkinson's drawings and vocabulary lists, and then this drawing here to repeat our argument. Tupaia's drawing of the Wa'amutu suggests that above all, his role was that of a teacher. Right? I'm sure he had other motives, but in that moment, he was their teacher. He was teaching Cook and his crew something about canoe construction, navigation, and we assume even Polynesian migration history. And Parkinson, Banks, and Cook were certainly interested. In their journals, they write about these things at length. For instance, they discuss two types of hull constructions expertly, right? They outline various canoe designs, single hull, double hull. They also report on traveling capacities of these constructions and the different purposes for which they use, be it fishing, fighting, comfortable coastal travel, short and long distance voyaging. It's all there. They know it all. And all this knowledge can easily blind us to the fact that they had very little experience when they wrote these things. We went through the journals again and again, and also the drawings by Parkinson of what, getting a sense of what they had actually seen by then. And it's not so much, right? Yes, they had seen small wa'a. They had seen airoi traveling double hulls that were paddled. And they had visited the boathouses of Wahine, Whare Harbour, and Raiate's Opua Harbour. So they'd seen hulls, but they'd not seen sails at all. They had not seen the majority of the vessels they so expertly described. How little they know from first-hand observation can be guessed, maybe, if you need more ideas, from this drawing in the top corner there, a wash again by Parkinson of a double-hulled pahi under sail. Note that Parkinson does not seem to have much of an understanding of what the crew actually does, and they're so big and they just sort of hang out. Lots of people just hanging out. And I'm just listening to Lolo this morning, and I'm just imagining Mario going, "What are you guys? Get to work, get to work." So he doesn't know. He has not seen us. He's doing it best he can. He's not seen it. He doesn't know what the crew does. And how much he's missing, if again, for Europeans, if we need proof, well, here's another wash of a European roughly of the same time, and note how much corresponds with what Tupaia was drawing, what he was actually trying to tell him. This guy, that guy, this guy, that guy, this guy here, that guy there, right? They have jobs to do, and Tupaia draws them. So of course, Tupaia knew exactly what he was drawing, and Cook, Banks, and Parkinson tried to learn from it best they could. Best they could. And with the help of this drawing, they could begin to talk about voyaging and navigation, vessel speeds, seasonal wind patterns, provisioning, and so on. Right? That's the beginning, but we also see how much they didn't quite get. A few days after these conversations, on the 15th of August, 1769, Cook records in his journal that Tupaia suggested voyaging to the westward from Raiatea, presumably to the Tongan Islands, and he famously adds, "These do not lay less than 400 leagues to the westwards of Raiatea." He says, that is Tupaia, that there are 10 or 12 days in going thither and 30 or more coming back, and that their paias sail much faster than this ship. All this I believe to be true, and therefore they may with ease sail 40 leagues a day or more. So clearly, Cook trusted Tupaia about this at a time when they shared little language together. What is more, from all we can establish, he trusted Tupaia without ever having seen the vessel in which these voyages were carried out, let alone in action or under sail. It is through Tupaia's teaching, it was through his drawings, that Cook could become the first European to understand the underlying patterns of Oceanian settlement against trade winds from west to east. Lars quoted this already yesterday, so I don't need to read this all out again. But this is Cook after conversations with Tupaia, who understands, right, that in these prose of Pais, from all accounts we can learn, these people sail in those seas from island to island for several hundred leagues, the sun serving them for a compass by day and the moon and stars by night, right? And they traveled the whole of Oceania. That's what he says. Shortly after setting down these lines, Tupaia, Cook, and his officers must have agreed on the joint project of drawing a map, right? That is the map we have been referencing of Tupaia's Sea of Islands. And I would want to invite you to take the kind of things we're learning from the drawings to the map now, right? It's a joint project. Europeans learn from Tupaia. He tries to convey things to them, and they sometimes understand, but not always. It's the map that will be at the center of our talk for a lot longer. It's very iconic, that map. People talk about it all the time. You sort of think people have always understood it. And we want you to see these two quotes here, that actually the legacy of European or Western understandings of that map is sort of, it's biased, right? These are the forces we've talked about so much because partly their collections are here. And on that voyage, they celebrate Tupaia, right? They say this map is a monument to the ingenuity of and the geographical knowledge of the Polynesians. At the same time, the Sun, also on that voyage, and really it's both of them writing both things, says, oh, I'm not so sure. If that map was correct, we would have sailed over many of these islands. So maybe he was just showing off. Maybe he was just showing off. Maybe he didn't know all of those and he just wanted to make himself bigger than he actually was. So after the map was sort of rediscovered or found again in the papers of Banks, it has been at the center of many discussions around really among historians and anthropologists about the ability of ancient Polynesians to carry out purposeful navigation across the Pacific. And I'm sort of referencing debates of the 1960s, 70s, 80s, when much of the work that Mimi told us about was already long happening, right? And the map has always been also there in conversation, in discussions and moments when people, around the cultural renaissance in the Pacific. So it's sort of there on the side to the actual work that we've heard about so much today. Our own work builds on all of that and the many conversations we've had. And we want to share with you how we've come to read it based on our work in the archives. and then on these conversations. Because we do think it's readable, different from the young Forster. We do think it makes sense. And it wants to be understood, like the drawings, it's there to, it wants to be understood. It's just us who need to put in a bit of an effort. Among the things that we consider in our research is this beautiful map of the Pacific, drawn, a chart by Richard Peckerskill, who is the master's mate on the Endeavour voyage. And it just shows you what Europeans knew at the time when they were doing that map. Nothing. Right? Not so much, right? It shows all the islands passed by the Endeavour between April and August 1769 in relation to islands passed by Wallace's previous voyage, right? That's sort of what they knew. Maitea, Tahiti, Morea, Maiao, Tetearoa, Wahine, Raiatea, Taha, Porapora, Tupaia, Mapiti, and finally, at the bottom, Ruvutu and the Australs group. And that's when that map is drawn. That's what they know in that moment. And next to Ruvutu, there's a little sentence that says, and I read it out to you, sorry for not putting it up there. In the neighborhood of the island, a native of Otahiti, that is Tupaia, describes 10 or 12 islands, other islands. Right? In the neighborhood of this, there's more. Someone says there's more. There's no doubt that this refers to Tupaia, who then pops up in all the journals of the voyage on that day. And people ask him, keep asking him, that's what we need to imagine. And he keeps giving them more islands. 10 or 12, and then the next one, no, more. So they all refer to the fact that he's describing, he's giving them names of islands, and he's sort of urging them to travel that way. West, northwest, south, southwest. Well, this indicates two things, that we think the work on Tupaia's map was begun here, while at Anchor and Ruvutu, and that this map, Pickersgill's chart, was probably there as a conversation starter. So how would they have then had that conversation? And again, after this morning, we can imagine, how would they have had that conversation? Very little language, very different knowledge traditions. And we're here and we're grappling with that, right? So as a reminder of things that we think we know, and maybe we don't quite know, European navigation, right, is about the idea of looking down at the planet, looking down at wherever you are from outer space, fixing the world below you, and then you measure, right? You measure from one space to the next, according to an invisible grid of lines that is imagined, longitude, latitude, and use technology to then measure how you get from one spot to the next, right? That's a very sort of brief summary of what this slide says. That's our tradition. That's what we all grew up with here, except for some. But it's a good to remind us. The next slide, of course, I'm deeply nervous about, and I won't even speak to it much. But this is sort of what we are hearing and learning as we are here, right? Roughly thinking about what would have Tupaia brought to the table. I sense, of course, that the wa'a is in the center of everything. You're in the wa'a, and you're in the center of that. And around you is a relational and dynamic world that you need to relate to, that you need to bring into relation as you travel. And we heard it from Mario, right? You need astronomy, but you need to know about all sorts of things. You need to know how to work with stars, need to know how to work with winds, as we'll talk about later, need to all sorts of things to navigate. And then you have lots of other things happening. We heard from Mimi about the swells yesterday and had a mind blown, right? Thinking, oh, that's, waves are easy. No, they're not. They're actually really, really complex things to read and to help you. And then you have all sorts of other techniques that you might use that we've, again, just learned from others, of course, reading, and many people in this room know this, right? To expand your target of where you're going so that you find the place you need to go. I think we most impressively heard it from Seta, right? Going from Aotearoa to Fiji, you have how many miles were you off? Did you say? And it didn't matter? 17. And in that way, it doesn't matter because you're there, right? Yeah. So that's this is the kind of different traditions we imagine to have been there in that moment. And then they begin to talk. How would they have, I have one more actually. How would they have begun to talk? We also heard it maybe from Mario and Lolo, I think, and also in Mimi's film, this idea that, okay, there's no written account. So you recite, you chant, there's knowledge in the chants and these chants, and there's just an example in that sense here. They'll have lists of islands. They have islands one after the other because they come one after the other. You have stars and you have this idea of going towards them and you pull them up. That is something that we believe also, because this comes from Raiatea, something that Tupaia would have brought to the table. So that's how they start their conversations, these very different traditions. We have, luckily, a first version of Tupaia's map, that is this one, and I won't need to talk about it much, just to say, again, how would they have started? We're fairly certain that they would have done this. The Europeans would have sat down, Cook maybe sat down and said, hey, these are the islands we know. They're the ones shaded in. This is how we think they work. Draw them for you, and now you go, off you go. This is your job now. So that is why for us, the Tahiti, Raiatea, and so on, they're sort of where they should be, according to how we think. And then he hands it over to Tupaia, and Tupaia draws all these other islands and places where they shouldn't be, according to Western logic. And the one example I have for you is that Hawaii is in the, what looks to us like northwest corner. Doesn't make sense. What would Tupaia have done? Thinking about that chant, we thought, okay, he would have probably recited them for them. He would have given them the kind of travel paths, the voyaging paths. So where do we find voyaging paths in these records that we have access to? And there are actually quite a few. Europeans wanting to know everything, they write down island lists, right? They ask, so which islands are there? And then people gave them islands in an order, of course, right? Here's one example. The one that I want to show you, it'll matter more, is this one by Robert Molyneux, the master of the Endeavour. And we are certain that it was this list that was the basis of the map and that was sort of used in conversation with Tupaia. Now, what we've done in our research, it sounds a lot easier than it was, and it was mostly Lars's work. I need to really point that out, is figure out these names. And then it's the easy part, number them, and then put numbers on the map. And out of a sudden, you sort of see patterns appearing, right? You see maybe 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, you know, that's sort of an top corner. You would have said these after the others. And then look at this. 15, 16, 17. This is 26. So whereas on a European map, you would have thought 15 and 6 have something to do with one another. Now you realize, no, they're not part of the same voyaging path. They're not part of the same story. So when you link all of these numbers, you get something that looks like this. It's a first step. And I'll hand over to Lars to help us understand.
Okay. So the two things that we have seen that Anja and I believe to have established about the process in which the map was made was, first, the Europeans set up the map for Tupaia. He didn't start it himself. They took an empty sheet of paper. They did 2 cardinal axes. And then they drew the islands that they had themselves seen in the Society Islands, plus Rutu, where they were at the time of the map making, in a European projection style. That's the second draft where Tupaia already fussed with them. And then they asked Tupaia to take over. Tupaia did, but he did not follow the model that was set up for him. He said, no, that model doesn't work for me. That's not how I navigate. I'm not looking down at the world like a bird. You know, I am on my vaka. I need to go from island to island to island according to the chance. So he drew paths. That's the first thing we established. This is a map showing paths, not island in one singular abstract relation as Europeans would do them. And we thought, wow, that's really, really cool. And then we made another discovery, which we believe makes this map even more mind-blowing. And this is, we began thinking about the word which Tupaia would have requested to be written on top of the cross where the cardinal axes meet. And that is E Avatea, signifying in Tahitian, the noon. Now we did more research into this, and we found out that they talked about Avatea. This is a slide, a piece of paper in the notebook of Solander, the Swedish naturalist on board, showing that people talk with Tupaia and other Tahitians about the course of the sun. And the top position, the highest position of the sun, where it no longer rises but starts to sink, is Avatea Te Mahana, the noon of the sun. Now, we do believe that the noon position of the sun, the highest position of the sun, has been significant also in Tahitian navigation, but we don't know enough about it yet. But what we can say is that it was the most crucial thing for Western European navigation. At noon, all officers had to be on deck. At noon, they took out all their instruments, compass, sextant, whatever they had. They took bearing of all the islands that they had been to write into their notebooks. The notebooks, a day in a notebook starts at noon, and it runs till noon the next day. Why was noon so important? Because the clocks were shitty. Only on the second voyage did they have the chronometer that was reliable and lasting. They had an hourglass on the first voyage that they had to turn every hour. And how do you know what hour it is? You have to every day check the highest position of the sun, strike the ship bell to know it's noon. So it was important for the timekeeping. The two other things that was absolutely crucial for is to know your latitude, your distance from the pole. You took the sextant measurement of the sun, you checked the angle, you referred to your tables, and you knew pretty much exactly what your latitude was. Longitude was harder. We don't talk about this now. And finally, and that's also something we heard about before, one problem is that your north on a compass has magnetic deviation. So you have to calculate true north from magnetic north. And if you are distant enough from the equator, the angle that you get towards the sun at noontime is fairly precise, and it gives you, in the southern hemisphere, the true north. This is something that Tupaia would have observed for 4 weeks by the time they were at Rurutu, happening every day on board the ship. And he must have thought, that may be a category that I know things about, the noon position of the sun, that they know things about, because that's where their compass needle points, right? And I may use Avatea as a translation device. That's key for us, as a translation device to translate from my world-making system into their representational model. So we assume that he requested that word, that's the first mapping draft, to be written across the cardinal axes. And I will now show you how we think the map was developed step by step by step in a process, in a long conversation. First step was Europeans drew the islands that they knew. Those are the islands that you see here, shaded in green, and Society Islands plus Rurutu straight to the south from there. That's, where they are on the second draft version of the map. The last island the Europeans drew, can you see that point there? Last islands Europeans drew was this one, Itiroa, which is another name for Rurutu. This is where they were probably when the map was made. Now Tupaia takes over. Next island he draws is this one, Rurutu. So he says, I'm drawing a new one. Yours doesn't work for me. I'm drawing a new one. Now, this is how you get to an island that is super important in my genealogy, and we know that from Tahitian sources and friends, that Aevave to the east of Rutu in the austral chain. Now, this is how we believe the Avatea system that Tupaia implemented works. You sit in Rutu on your va'a. You take bearing to Avatea, which is your true north. This is also where your compass needle points. You know, he may have told Cook, place your compass on that island, it will point there, where the axes cross. Then you get the bearing to Reiveve. And if you measure that ankle, you would see it's 110 degrees south by southeast. And that is to the degree. This is the angle from Rutu to the degree. Once that system is established, we believe Tupaia worked through Molyneux's list of islands that Tupaia would have chanted or shared for Molyneux, who he was quite close with on shipboard. So the next path that he drew was from the Southern Cooks through the Australs, which includes that passage going from Atiu Mangaya to Rimatara to Puere Veve and Rapaiti. It's making an arch here. Why is it making an arch, even though it's actually a fairly straight line? Because at every stop, you reorient towards Avatea. Move on, next island, reorient. So this is how the arches come to the map. Next passage goes from Rotuma, which seems to have a super important role in Society Islander genealogies, according to the sources, to the west of Samoa, to Savaii, Upolu in Samoa, and then, so that's an eastern trajectory, an eastern trajectory, and then down south to Vava'u in Tonga. That's the path you see there in green. Next path, and that's a fairly recent discovery. We had missed some things in our earlier research, from Rarotonga to the northern voyaging hub of Puka Puka. If your north is here, that is a north by northwestern passage, and that is how you also find it in a Mercator projection map. Next passage, according to Molyneux's list, would be going from Hitipoto, an old name for Manga River, to Hititotereva, that's an old name for Pitcairn. And from Pitcairn, it obviously continues, if this is your north, to the east. So the eastern Pitcairn Islands, and then we're a bit unsure about the last stop, Te Atauhiti, which we couldn't translate. It could be either Rapanui's, where we've got the question mark down there, but the bearing would rather point towards a more northeastern trajectory. And we know, it's actually certain that there have been Polynesian encounters around the Galapagos and the coast of Colombia. So we're not certain, but it may also be that Tupaia drew that path. So that's why the question marks are there. Then Tupaia would have decided to do an alternative route from Rotuma to Samoa, because if you go via, if you go straight to Savaii, you only have one stop on Wallace. If you take a slightly more southerly route via Fortuna, the newer islands, and then head back north to Tutuila and go on to Manua and Motuumanu, Rose Island, that probably is a safer path, at least is what navigators tell us. So you have that connection back there in the west. Then Tupaia decides to draw the absolutely crucial connection connecting Western Polynesia with Central Polynesia, and it seems that Tupaia advises to go from Tonga to Rarotonga. Island of departure is Uiha, south of Vava'u, with a stopover in Niue, and then go to Rarotonga. The bearings, the Avatea bearings, are again absolutely perfect for that passage in the way that Tupaia draws it. Cook says Tupaia had been to Tonga, so because the bearing patterns are so good, that may actually be true. Bearing patterns are more off if you go to the remote areas, and we believe that Tupaia had a lot of those remote voyages from tradition, from chants, definitely for Hawaii, definitely for Rapa Nui, probably for Samoa. Tonga may be something that he had voyaged himself. That's that passage there. Vava'u, Niue, Rarotonga. Then he jumps to the Marquesas. What's clear is that we have Wapo and Hiva Oa. Probably the other island is Nukuhiva. We are not absolutely sure. And huh? Yeah. But sizes for Tupaia, size is genealogical importance, not geographical size. And then the most mind-blowing trip is obviously from down there. Marquesas from down there, Te Whenua Tane in Marquesas and Te Whenua Inata, all the way up to Oahu in Hawaii. If you're down there, if Awatea is your north, it's about 335 degrees north by northwest. That's the direction Tupaia gives. Remember, that's a passage that hadn't been made like for 300 years probably by the time of Cook, but 2 or 3 degrees off exactly what Tupaia draws. And the system is consistent. I mean, there's not a single, on average, deviation is anything between 5 and 6%. It was really quite amazing. Tupaia continues to draw passages then within the Tuamotus, and here he abandons the Awatea system. Why does he abandon it? Because the Europeans already had their own maps of Tuamotan islands, and they would have interfered. First thing he draws is, we assume it's what he thinks is the pathway that the Endeavour took through the Tuamotus to Tahiti, coming in here. And then he drew how you can get from Tahiti via the northern Tuamotus to the Marquesas to make the long voyage up to Hawaii, which is this passage here. So that is how we believe Tupaia's map works. It's been misunderstood by Europeans for the longest time because, you know, they thought a map is what they know a map is, but this is not a map. It is a map, but it's a translation by a very, very bright mind who attempts to translate one way of organizing the world into a different representational model. So one thing we stress again and again is that this is not an expression of an indigenous knowledge tradition. It's an indigenous knowledge tradition translated and simplified so that stupid European minds may understand the basics of an indigenous model that is much, much more complex and much, much more holistic than that. Various orientations, the center islands are in European projections and some of the Tuamotan islands, or the others using that Awatea system to organize paths and provide bearings for island to island to island voyaging and travel. Are you still with us? Yeah. Because we have another few slides. Yes, this is the world. In our, representation models that Tupaia represented on those maps, and we don't say you can sail with them. Some people have claimed that we say this. We don't say this. He's just trying to translate something of what he knows for people whose minds tick differently, and who can really only understand that. I want to briefly add that we don't believe that this is exhaustive of the voyaging knowledge of Central Polynesians at the time. We believe that this map is a genealogical map, that it shows Tupaia's whakapapa basically in terms of where his ancestors had migrated from and to. If you know where Rotuma is to the very west, if you know where Samoa is, if you know where Tonga is, of course you know where Fiji is. It's not that Tupaia hasn't put on Fiji because he doesn't know where it is. It's because it's not part of his genealogy. It's like Mario saying, the Marshall Islander Wallab is not my camel. I'm not going to comment on this one, right? So we believe that, especially, have you seen the size of Rotuma? the size of Rotuma and the importance of Rotuma here. Genealogically, Sava'i would have been the more important island for Tupaia. He comments to the Europeans, Sava'i is the father of all the other islands. So he credits Sava'i with being like the origin of the migration in many ways, but Rotuma is bigger. And in many ways, we believe that Rotuma may have been the voyaging hub to also then go further west. And we have learned from Luki and from Betty that there had been voyages from Tomoko to Rotuma. So their world is connected with that world. We also know that via Tuvalu and the Gilberts, you know, if you can do all that, going north from Rotuma up to Mario and Lolo's world would have been easy. So all these worlds would have been connected. The map is not exhaustive of all the voyaging knowledge. It's a voyaging genealogy of one particular tradition. Correct? So that's been our research for 10 years or so. And then we came to a point where we said, we have learned how Tupaia translated everything for Europeans so that they may understand things. And 250 years later, we hope that we have brought some light into the processes that happened on board the Endeavour and how Tupaia tried to translate these things. But we came to a point where we wanted to know more about how Tupaia actually would have navigated, what kind of knowledge system he would actually have translated from. And this is how we got in touch with Mimi actually a couple of years ago, and how we established that relation and began conversations with all the people whom we have invited. And I think it's important to again stress that we have no title to those knowledges, that we only begin to understand about those things. And it's very important us to share everything that we have so that you guys can continue this and bring this to traditions that you own. We don't own any of these traditions. Still, what we have begun to understand is that a lot of the voyaging knowledge that is around in the Pacific, and especially in the Polynesian parts where we have done our research, is Polynesian Voyaging Society knowledge, which draws on the teachings of Maopailuk, quite selectively, probably in terms of the holistic knowledge that Maopailuk had, especially in view of stars. We heard about this from Mimi. Knowledge that was then developed further in the Bishop Museum, and that led to the star compass that you see here. We want to emphasize that we think that this is an amazing model. We want to acknowledge that it has allowed new generations of Oceanian navigators to navigate successfully with amazing precision and success. And we also want to acknowledge that we are not traditionalists. We believe that changing traditions and adapting them to new influences, inspirations, has always been not only a Polynesian or Oceanian, but like a global way of life. And that this modern model is amazing. What we believe is it is a mistake to assume that this model was the model that some of the historical migrations had worked with. So like it's a mistake to project it back onto history. And we have some indications in the archive of Tupaia that we want to share with you. So first of all, and that's Mimi also sharing this already, a star-based compass is not something that you find a lot in Southern Oceania, at least. But what you find is many, many wind-based system, where the basic calibration of the system is wind. So all these things in red are wind compasses that have been recorded across history. And Mimi, I think you had even more on your slide. That's one from the Cook Islands, so fairly close to the Society Islands, based on recorded in the 19th century that Mimi's also shown. That's one from Tahiti from the 1930s. And then to our great surprise, and you only see things when you look for them, we checked the archive again. And just following from the island listed Molyneux shed, we have this list of wind names that Tupaia shared, and we began to study this more closely. working with the names of the winds last year in Tahiti with linguists and stuff, trying to find out what an English-speaking mind would have made of the Tahitian that they heard with Libor Prokop, Mirhonas Lars, and others. And then, however, especially studying Mimi's work. And we have realized that Tupaia probably sat down on the beach, probably like with Molyneux, like we have seen in the film Kavea or Hulani, sitting down with a student and drawing things and naming things. And what we see in this list in the archives is probably more similar to that. We see 4 categories of wind, and I'm sorry that I oriented it to the north. It's easier to it's easier to talk about this to students and European audiences when they're not mind-fucked as much when you keep north up. But here's east, north, and so forth. We have a wind which seems to be a genealogical wind, an origin wind, Tumutumuroa, from the north. Then we have Mara'i winds, those are the trades. Then we have a westerly wind, Tu'erau, that would be the Tokelau in other Polynesian languages. And then we have cyclone season winds, Mawa'e or Maoke winds. The compass is not quite dissimilar from a system recorded from the Tuamotan Puhoru. A lot of the wind names correspond. But conceptually, you find it's extremely and surprisingly close to what Mimi has shared with us yesterday in her presentation on the Taumakan system. And you will see a lot of the slides that Mimi showed in worse resolution again in a moment. So here is the Taumakan Tinohuanga Te Matangi system with its 32 wind positions in the different houses. And I'm very privileged not having to explain it because Mimi has explained it much better yesterday. I just want to stress again that if I understand, and it's a bit scary to have Luke and Mimi and Betty here in the room, what we understand is that it's a holistic system where the basic calibration is wind. Wind is really only then again calibrated by more factors. And a quote from Mimi, Kavea explained exactly how wind positions, swell patterns, seasons, stars, including sun positions, and weather are interrelated. So we try to learn from Kavea's teachings and apply them to the Tahitian model as best as we can in view of wind and weather work, wind, weather, and astronomical information, wind positioning, seasons, and astronomy, the moon, about which we find not so much, at least in the published records by Mimi, but Mimi shared with me that moon does play important roles in Tamako, but we've heard a lot about moon from Mario and Lolo this morning. We want to briefly talk about calendrics and especially the Matari'i system. This is, one of the questions we had, Matari'i, the Pleiades, and which role they play. And finally, it's very important to us to briefly talk about seasonal voyaging from Tupaia's archive. And when I say Tupaia's archive, we always work from very little snippets of information that Europeans picked up, and we blow them up to probably unethical proportions in our argument. And you tell us when we are going too far. First, wind and weather work. Mev has stressed in the evening panel yesterday that one of the most controversial thing has been in the panels that they did, talking about how humans can affect weather. But this is something that we not only find in Kavea, who in the in-between seasons can call wind to desired positions, but also in the Tupaia archive. So both Banks and Parkinson observed Tupaia calling up a wind, calling up Tane to bring a wind, foretelling that it will arrive exactly at noon. And in the records, they make fun of it, especially banks who can't deal with that, but the wind comes. Wind comes at noon from the exact direction that Tupaia predicted. Predicting the weather is something that to us seems absolutely essential, something that Western sciences are extremely bad at, but that traditional navigators seem to have been exceptionally good at. And using information from the natural world that are difficult for Western scientists to grasp. We had a conversation with a astronomer most recently based here, and he told us, how can you foretell wind and weather by looking at the Milky Way? Impossible. But talking to Mimi, you get different information. So Banks writes, Tupaia and his people excel much in predicting the weather. They have various ways of doing it. I only understood one, but they look at the quarter of the heavens from whence the wind shall blow by observing the Milky Way, which is generally bent in an arch either one way or the other. This arch they conceive is already acted upon by the wind. So that's quite close to what Kaveya and others seem to have known. Calendrics is absolutely important in the Society Islander traditions. This is again Mimi's system. And I just want to stress again that solar positions are extremely important in this model because they structure the seasons, including the voyaging seasons. Trade winds blow between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. Most winds blow from cyclonic positions between summer solstice and autumn equinox. Tamako people say that the wind follows the sun. Wind follows sun. The sun rises and sets between 4 main wind positions. Mimi has explained all about this. Now, this is just us now. This is not in the archive. This is not us trying to apply this as best as we can to Tupaia's model, working with the wind names that Tupaia provides, and where we are moving to a new category of wind and discussing this with Tahitian experts. And we believe we can project Kaveya's teachings also into that model using the solstice and equinox position to create a certain calendrics within this model. What we also believe to be very important, however, because it's so essential in society Islander traditions, is Matari'i Iraro, the sinking of the Pleiades, and Matari'i Inia, the rising of the Pleiades. That means Matari'i Inia is the day where the Pleiades appear above the horizons, 4 fingers above the horizons at dawn, and then are up in the sky for that period. Matirirao means they sink with the sun and are not in the sky. And those are the 2 main periods of the Tahitian year, the season of plenty, starting with Matari'i Inia, and the season of scarcity, starting with Matari'i Raro. And that again corresponds with Mario and Lolo's model of the 2 seasons of scarcity and plenty. I've unfairly tilted Mimi's model to the north on the left, just to show you. I could have tilted ours, but it's done with the PowerPoint. It's very difficult to tilt, so I tilted Mimi's because it was a PDF, just to show you how similar, at least in our reconstruction, both models possibly are. You know, it's a lot of speculation in that kind of work. What I briefly want to talk about is moon, because Mario and Lolo also talked about moon so much. We know that in Tupaia's system, moon was absolutely essential to the micro calibration and the micro structuring of the year and the seasons. In speaking time, either past or to come, they never use any term but moons. They have 13 moons rather than 10. And they can predict weather through moon phases and moon time. They have 29 moons in every month, is what the Europeans establish. That's really, again, mind-fucking them because they try to match the 29 moon days to a European calendar. This is Solander's attempt to bring them into conversation, but it doesn't add up. Talking to our Tahitian friends, what Europeans simply miss is that the new moon in Tahiti has 3 days. It's the days where you don't see the moon. The new moon in Tahitian is the first moon that you see. So if you add those 3, you're again within a more Western kind of pattern, and then you just stretch months or condense months to sync moon and that's what Janusz talked about, to sync moon and astronomical star phenomena. Stars don't really appear very much in the European archive about Tupaia either, which is quite a surprise, but Tupaia seemed to have been reluctant to talk about stars much, perhaps because he thought Europeans don't understand much about this. But Banks says from observation that their knowledge was more profound. Tupaia's knowledge of stars was more profound as that of his own astronomer. So he writes, they can tell in what part of the heavens they are to be seen in any month when they are above the horizon. They also know the time of their annual appearing and disappearing to a greater nicety, far greater than would be easily believed by a European astronomer. Now comes the most tricky part of this presentation for me. And I want to briefly speak towards what Mimi shared, but what also Lolo and Mario shared about navigating with invisible stars. Stars which are not seen in the sky, but which are underneath, trying to speak towards the idea of partner stars and so forth. And again, we are perhaps unethically blowing up very minute things that we find in the archive. And before I talk about this, I want to credit my friend Libor Prokop, Tahitian ethno-astronomer, to whom I need to credit everything that I need to, that I'll talk about in a moment, about that one line that we find in Cook's archive when they are already in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and departing from there towards Australia. On 1st March 1770, Cook notes something curious in his diary. Cook writes, "The new moon made her appears last night, and Tupaia told us that this is New Year's Day at the island, that is Reatia, on which account we paid him the proper compliments." Tupaia says, and if we calculate that they crossed the date line, probably on 27th February 1770, March 1770, that it's Matari'inia. That doesn't make any sense because Matari'inia is in November and not in February. And that got Libor thinking and doing some observations. And this is what we want to share with you now. Can we perhaps turn down the lights a bit? Can you see well? So this is the sky at Matari'iraru, the sinking of the Pleiades. The horizon is here. And you see the Pleiades have sunk with the sun. Always happens around 18 March, plus or less 2-3 days. And I've set the sky for Opoa Harbor in Reatia, Tapu Atea Marae, for the year 1769. The time is exactly 30 minutes after sunset at 1805. So the Matari disappeared. But what's really important, according to Libor, and what I've understood, is not just Matari'i in this particular system, but that the universe, according to Tahitian creation myths, is in perfect balance. In the Tahitian star system, you have Taurua stars, which are bearing stars, and you have pillar stars, pole stars. And those pillar stars are mythically absolutely significant, and their names vary. It's important that their function is a pillar. Now, at the exact moment of Matari'i Raro on that day, the front pillar in Tahitian creation, Anamua, this is Antares and Scorpio, and that corresponds in the Tamako system to Salo, am I correct? Is just about to rise above the horizon. That's the blue one there. Anamuri, the back pillar propping up the sky, is just about to sink. And that is Aldebaran in Taurus. That would be Sino, if I'm not mistaken, in the Tamako system. And the pillar star in the zenith position overhead, Anaroto, is Regulus in Lion, having the universe in perfect balance. Now for Matari'i Nia, the situation is very similar, just inverse. You have Anamua, the front pillar, just about to sink above the horizon. Sorry, the slides one. Anamuri, that is Aldebaran, has just risen above the horizon. You see the Pleiades in the red circle, 4 fingers above the horizon. So this is the exact moment of Matari'i Nia. And you have former Haut, Taurua Nui Fa Tereva'a in exact overt position, taking the position of Regulus for Matari'i Nia. And now comes the moment. That sky that you see here on 27 February 1770, when Tupaia said, "Right now is my New Year's Day," at the exact hour of noon, when the sun is in zenith, in the highest position, on the new moon, moon age 2 days old, you have the Matari'i Nia sky. It's exactly the same sky. Anamua sinking, Anamuri rising, Pleiades in that position. None of those stars can be seen because it's bright daylight noon. Still, Tupaia knew exactly where every single of those stars is. Why does he tell this at the exact hour of noon? Again, because that is a moment when Europeans talked about those things. This is when they did their own measurements, when they did their sextant things and stuff. This is when Europeans had their conversations, as we have just seen. So we can deduce from that Tupaia knew stars, both visible and invisible. We assume that the Matari'i system is closely related with lunar calendrics because Tupaia predicted it by the moon. And we need to learn more about Avatea because we always assumed he just did it to translate for the Europeans, but maybe there's also more significance to the lunar position of the sun in Tahitian ancestral navigation. Just one more slide. This is Mimi talking about asterisms for navigation corresponding to certain seasons for navigation. And we also believe that this is absolutely essential for the way in which Tupaia navigated. Tupaia taught the Europeans that to go against the trades, you have to wait till the months of November, December, and January, where you have constant westerly winds, To'ero winds. When Tupaia talks about traveling to Tonga, he says you need 12 days to go there, you need 30 to go back against the winds. And there's an obscure quote in Johann Ralph Forster that nobody ever talks about, but Forster had information from somebody who talked about Tupaia that an ancestor of Tupaia apparently did a 3-month voyage to the west and a 9-month return voyage. And I think what this really means is that those voyages were cyclical. You had to have a year's time to voyage on the trades and then come back on the westerlies. And that's, I think, very often, I mean, Mimi talks about how all those modern sailing boats have to be somewhere for certain festivals and occasions. It's not in sync with how the ancestors, I suppose, would have navigated, because you had to wait for the star and you had to wait for the season and you had to perform the right rituals. at the passes, you had to hang out with ancestors and kin somewhere till the winds were right and come back. Yeah, Anja, do you want to take over? Yeah, I mean, we want to learn more about how the voyaging chants Tupaia based those routes on connect with the paths that he drew. And in the best of all worlds, we want to understand better how the wind compass therefore relates to the chart, how specific voyaging seasons, also in the lunar calendar, correspond to particular voyaging paths that Tupaia chose to share. How that corresponds, especially also with stuff that is not in the archives, spell patterns, everything that Mimi has talked about in the Tuonara Te Mate system, what the asterisms were for doing all those voyages in particular seasons, genealogies, and so forth. And this is why we are so thrilled and excited to actually have people in the room who know such things, because we have no clue about that stuff.
We also, just to remind you of ages ago, an hour and a half ago, or something like that, we also hope to learn more from the drawings, right? And yesterday, listening to Chief Kauea, right? You start with planting a garden. We did not even talk about those plants that are there with the voyaging wa'a. So that would be one of the things we would like to do. And we would also love to talk more and learn more about another map that Tupaia did, which is the one of the Leeward Society Islands, where he has lots of annotations for us to, think with. And we think they have a lot to do with how people, he was trying to share how people actually shared land resources on Raiatea. But that's, as Lars said, for future research. So like Lars, I want to thank you for your patience.
Okay. Well, we can't moderate ourselves, so.
Thank you, Lars and Anja, for this super interesting talk. So we're giving you room to ask your questions. So please raise your hands if you have any questions.
Okay. A quick one. Why did you not use Ben Finney's Tahitian wind compass?
Why did we not use it?
Yes. I mean, why did you choose? He used various information to fill in the 32 positions rather than use the one you used.
Problem with Ben Finney's compass is that the position which correspond have very different names.
Yeah.
All the 19th and 20th century Tahitian compasses, the winds have changed. For instance, Tu'arau in all the 20th century compasses are north, whereas in all the 18th century compasses, Tuamotu, Zen, Teiti, they are west. And a lot of the other wind names don't correspond. The correspondence is best for the oldest recorded compasses in the regions. And Finney recorded it from living traditions in the 20th century, and it just doesn't match.
Can I ask Mimi a question?
Yeah.
Do you have a theory why that might be, Mimi? Why that shift?
No, no. I mean, I always think it's generally just more and more basically involvement with European kind of documentation or
also we learned that
contact.
There's many compasses around, and many are land-based.
Yeah.
I mean, they're specialized systems. Some are navigation based and some are land-based.
Right. But my impression on Taumako, and I may be wrong, is that, I mean, at least from what I understood from Luke's grandfather, was that it was 100% the same system for land versus sea. However, when David Lewis ran into this problem when he was revising We the Navigators, which got published in 96 or 95. No, 96, because we were there. I can't remember. Anyway, 94 maybe. But the thing is, you know, when you point out wind positions, when you're standing on land, it's affected by the land. So you say, where does the wind sit down in, you know, Te Tokelau, and you're gonna point to a different place because the land bent it. Okay, so I wanted to say something I didn't say yesterday. Those 32 positions, there are the combinations of positions, you know, like let's say just the primary 8 ones. So from say Te Tonga to Te Ulu, Te Ulu Tonga, that is not in the middle. That's not just a point, it's a whole sector. It's a point and it's a whole sector. And it goes the same thing when you make ones in the middle. So you get 16 positions. Then you have not only those named points, but you have the sector in between the 2 points that define that sector. So that's very interesting when you if you're trying to figure out, you know, where the wind's coming from. Anywhere in the sector will do. And so basically you have to refer to other information to know, if in European mind, if you want to know, you know, where the wind was coming from, you know, Te Tonga, for example, will refer from any of those 3 positions that have the name Te Tonga in it, or actually 4 in the name. So sectors, it makes things more interesting and complicated. Okay, and the only other thing I want to say is that narrative, when you said that narrative, I mean, gosh, I love your I'm so blown away by your presentation. So much information and thought. But that narrative about, I think you said that the Polynesian Voyaging Society furthered what Malpiala taught them. It's not true. That's not what happened. Nainoa Thompson was in Bishop Planetarium for perhaps 1.5 years, developing the system that they use, the star system. That was years before he was able to go and ask Mount Piailug to come help. So on the first voyage, Mount Piailug was not, I mean, he would have shared with anyone who asked, but there weren't a lot of questions. They didn't know. And here's the kicker, is that Mount Piailug, when Nainoa went to find Mount Piailug, he asked, please, will you teach us your navigation? We need it. We can't, you know, they lost somebody at sea. It wasn't working to continue. Basically begging Mal, please come would you teach us what you know? And his reply was, I cannot teach you what you know, what I know. You are too old. Send me your babies and I'll teach them. It takes too long. There's too much to learn. So I'm sorry, it's a picky thing of all the brilliant stuff you've understood in presenting, but that narrative makes it seem like the source of the PBS system was Mao, and it wasn't. If as a mariner, I were to describe what Mao taught, it was seamanship. And seamanship and learning how to be a crew and take care of each other is essential to successful navigation, as Mario Lolo said. But it's not what that narrative suggests.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, much appreciated.
In our position, we can't say all the things that we want to say, but you can. Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Hello. Is this working? Oh, yes. Hello. My name's Kavita Peterson. I'm a museology student with the Fijian Heritage. So I've just been really enjoying this whole weekend. It's been fantastic, and including the work that you're doing. I'm hoping my question will not be taken the wrong way, but I'm quite curious because, I mean, a lot of the presentation that we were given was, I guess, looking at how, you know, people of European descent have misinterpreted and perhaps misconstrued, I guess, you know, these drawings over time and things like that. So I'm just curious as to how, you know, the work that you're doing, how will this be different? I know that you've been consulting with, you know, people from the French Polynesian community. So I'm just wondering, is there anything else that you're hoping will sort of counteract this, I guess, not tendency, but the potential for misconstruing, misinterpreting, misunderstanding? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you imagine that there was a page of that in the talk that we then left out? But no, but that as in, I mean, I guess we feel that, or that's part of, it's been with us as we do this work. I think my reply would be to sort of one thing that we said yesterday, it's sort of living in the city with this kind of archive. One of the islanders I showed you that I went sort of over quickly, but that is also really relevant, sits with the State Library Berlin. The other first map of Tupaia is in Braunschweig, Germany. So they sit here, and it's, well, that can be sort of take, oh, and so it's mine to look after, but we hope that it comes across as that maybe also care work, that they sit in these archives and people don't even look at them. So translating them in a way that they can relate to work that's going on is what we aim to do. I think, I mean, I don't know how people, like, we can't know how everybody judges the work that we're doing. And we try, and this is sort of, this being here has sort of been the result of that work, you know, doing that, and then more and more coming to the moment where we feel like even more, we need to, you know, have other people on stage. And yes, we've taken a lot of your time now, but for the rest of the time, we hope not to take it in that sense. But the future can only tell. I think partly that would be the hope, right? You know, for other people to come to know better, to know better, and to then take it and do something with it that we cannot do. So for first response, Lars.
I'm less nervous about this question when it comes to the work on the map, because the map wanted to be understood by Europeans. That was the whole point. It's a piece of translation. And we are very conscious that there are certain knowledge traditions that we don't have access to, and we do what we can, or we have done until we come to the Wind Compass, what we can do best. And that is know the archives and put in a real effort to know everything that can be known, and give it back. What we did throughout our research, we had tons of USB sticks, and we handed out all the archival information to the people we worked with and stuff. So there's certain work ethics that we also put into place, and the feedback we get from Oceanian communities is also always very appreciative. They often have people who don't do a lot of hard work to tell them who they are, and at least I think we've done hard work. The people who criticized us most for the map were all white people. They can't deal well with what we've done, a lot of them, some of them. We've had no criticism really from people in the region, interestingly. We are more nervous about that work because that is definitely more speculative, and it draws on knowledge to which we really have no title, and that did not want to be translated. Right? So we come into this very much from sideways. And ultimately, we haven't published this either, and we will never publish this in our own names, but only in collaboration with people whom we trust. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Wolfgang Kruhl from Berlin. Just a detailed question about this drawing. Where does the wind come from? Does it come from the left or from the right?
And see, we could do this with our students and no one would ask that question ever. And of course, it's the first thing you wonder about, right? If this is, we don't know, this is certainly intonation. The wind should be blowing from here, right?
No, it's going backwards. It's going backwards.
So at least the way it's drawn, it looks like it's going backwards. We haven't mentioned it, hoping that you wouldn't catch us. But here, but see then there are sandwich and there's Mimi, and now they're explaining to you because that's why
No, that's pennants. They're made of bark and feather, and they indicate the winds, and that means the wind blows them.
Yeah.
Yes. But the boat usually goes.
Yeah, any comment? Any ideas as to why that might be? No. There are so many things that are so really weird about this drawing. As with all the drawings, and what we find helpful sometimes is to think about them again. These are pieces of, someone's trying to explain stuff, but they're also made on the go in that sense. They're having conversations, and it's by someone who's not, that's not his job to draw that way, right? So not everything needs to be like perfect, but that's we wish we had a better explanation, really. And we're just waiting for someone to say, yeah, surely. There we go. Sit down.
So that's what we call a telltale. So telltale is pointing to where the wind direction is coming from. So all we have on board is we use telltale. So we have it on the shrouds, we have it on the sail. So it tells you where the wind is coming from. So if the telltale is pointing that way, that means the wind is coming from this way. So that one, the telltale will react before the sail. So if the wind change, the telltale react first before the sail, so we can tell. So the wind is changing. Just go in.
That's brilliant, Seta. And again, our main point is, those are not drawings that somebody drew so that Europeans could put them on their living room wall. They're not meant to be representation of something from nature, but it's the product of collaborative knowledge sharing, somebody translating what all this is for and how it reacts and stuff, right? So it does not need to be as it was. It needs to do the job of transmitting something if you don't have language.
May I ask a question? Thank you very much for this extremely thought-provoking presentation. It's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. And I wanted to ask a question regarding the map, Tupaia's map. For many years, I was very fascinated by this map, and thank you very much for giving further insights into how it could be read. You said that at least some pieces of information on that map are grounded in genealogical sense, and also absences of or gaps on the map can be explained through genealogy. And could you tell a little bit more on how you came to that knowledge and where is it founded on?
While Lars is talking, could we maybe get the presentation up and I'll just go to the slide, and that would help us.
It's ultimately a bit speculative, I have to admit. It's also not something we've ever written about. a lot of the traditional chants have disappeared. A lot of those traditional chants would have been secret of the navigation guild and would not be shared with other people. Some have survived mainly through the missionary efforts. You know, whilst we are very often accusing missionaries of erasing cultures, they have also actually preserved a lot. I mean, a lot of what people work from, or almost everything that people work from is missionary records. And for quite a number of the paths, we do have chants. For instance, the long voyage to, if you go from Tahiti via the northern Tuamotus to the Marquesas and all the way up to Hawaii, that is exactly the path in the Birth of New Lands from Hawaii chant that you have briefly seen, that has this phrase, the sea casts up, where you fish one island after the other and after the other till you see Peles volcanoes and you've made it to Hawaii. So it works for some of the paths. For some of the other paths, we have no evidence for that, but it's quite striking, quite simply, that all the islands are relevant within the genealogies that are there. And we speak into the genealogy experts who can confirm that all the paths are extremely important in terms of the ancestral migration patterns. And islands which are logically islands within reach and close, like Fiji, for instance, are simply not on there. So that's the only evidence we have.
And I might have something not quite so much related to the paths, but something else that we've worked on and also published in that long article are the annotations that you see here. There's a moment on the voyage where the European journals in Aotearoa, New Zealand, record Tupaia in conversation with someone called Tupaia. And thanks, we haven't prepared this for you, so it'll have to be brief and very superficial. But Banks records that conversation best he can. And they are talking about the legends of their ancestors. And we find elements of that conversation on the map here. You have the Tahitian captions on the map. And just try and read out one to you. To be honest, I get nervous in these exactly. Yeah.
Means Tupaia's ancestors arrived in a ship here.
Yeah. So he was certainly sharing that too. And but he wasn't actually in that part. He wasn't sharing with the Europeans. They were listening in. They were listening in that very moment in Aotearoa, New Zealand, when Tupaia, their ancestor cousin, from Hawaii arrived. They are sharing ancestral. They are sharing whakapapa, and this is partly recorded on that map. So in that sense, we also have through these captions a sense of that was being shared. Banks was at least, this is the map that was made for Banks. Banks must have at least wanted it to be written down. We don't think Tupaia, why would he have wanted to write it down? That's not his style at the time, right? So Banks had it recorded. And what the bits that were recorded give us a sense that exactly were the conversations that were happening. And we talked about how much the Europeans might have missed. So it's just snippets, as Lars said, we're blowing them up, but that particular sentence, for instance, is one of those that give us a sense.
We are running a bit out of time, so we have time for one more question, I think. So hand the mic over.
Okay, thank you for this vibrant presentation. Yes, okay. It's more a comment than a question, but I wonder about the ancestral dimension of that knowledge. That means that, in fact, there is maybe a necessity to have more information about, to try to find out better the historical depth of that knowledge. That means that if you consider what has been wrongly named Polynesian outliers, in some outliers you have an influence on other islands, Melanesian islands, which have a terrestrial culture, which are not maritime at all. And you have the same wind system, you have the same cosmographical representation. for people who are not seafarer. But for example, in South Vanuatu, you have that exactly for Tama, but you don't have it in the center of Vanuatu, and you don't have it in the north Vanuatu, where the badly named again return travel to Melanesia have been much more have started much more earlier than in the south of Vanuatu, where the return voyage have been much more late. And if you consider in New Caledonia, like in Uvea, then the influence has not worked as much also. So I just think that, in fact, if you consider the late or deep history, that knowledge comes from a very achieved late period, which has not worked maybe for long centuries.
Hello. Yes. Hello.
Hi.
So my name is Leilani Wong, and I am actually from Tahiti. So I'm currently studying here in Germany. I would just like to note the irony of coming all the way here to learn about my own culture, but I very much appreciated your presentation, and I can see the level of work and investment that went into learning more about these things. I suppose I would just ask a quick question, which is, you mentioned, for example, the Heva Tupapo, the ceremonial cloak, and some of these other items that are apparently held in the British libraries or in other archives here. Has there been any interest in repatriating them or having them become more available to people then from that culture and to be more able to study them?
That's a wonderful question, and the answer is very recently, yes. I'm in close touch with the Musée de Tahiti des Îles, Miriam Abonul there, and they have succeeded for the opening of the new museum to get a Chief Mona's cloak on loan, at least for 3 years now, from the UK. And they are confident that they can hang on to it for like indefinite loan. So yes, it's starting to happen,
And I guess, I mean, these are the questions not really for Lars and me to ask, but very much to emphasize, right? This is to sort of, push it up in the feed or wherever. That's a good question. And it's to the museum staff here to sort of see what kind of conversations are possible.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.
You have a break.